No, just grab a seat there, I'll call you. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. If everyone could please find their seats. My name is Sharaf Maujud. I am the president of SAJA, the South Asian Journalists Association. You can applaud, that's totally fine. I work for NBC News, special reports to Brian Williams. We have some board members here. I want to give a big thank you to the Columbia Journalism School for allowing us to host this special event tonight. Tonight's event sold out in a record 5 hours. All 200 seats that you're sitting in was gone within 5 hours, and there's a waiting list about 50 people deep just for this event. That just tells you how special this is. We planned this event about 5 days ago, because that's when Rabia told us she was available. So literally in 4 or 5 days, we pulled this off. So thank you for coming. Thank you for registering. Thank you for RSVPing. Before we begin, I want to remind everybody that we will be taking questions from the web, social media, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, all that. All of you have smartphones, so please, we highly recommend you take photographs and use the hashtag SAJA, S-A-J-A, serial, S-A-J-A-S-E-R-I-A-L. So please, take a lot of photographs. Those of you on the live stream, we're live streaming this. It's all over our Facebook. You could tell your friends. I know there's people in England, there's people in India, there's people in California, there's people in Texas watching this right now. Please use that hashtag, and if you have any questions, we will hopefully answer them. So, you guys don't want to hear from me, so I'll speed this up. Our moderators for the evening is Asim Rahman and Arun Venugopal. Let me read their bios, and I'll call them up. Asim is a local lawyer who has worked on various sides of the aisle, including as a prosecutor in Brooklyn and as a white-collar defense attorney, as an in-house counsel for a large corporation, and as a pro bono counsel to an individual convicted of murder. He's the co-founder and former president of the Muslim Bar Association of New York, and he currently serves as general counsel in the new office of the Inspector General for the NYPD. He is kind of a big deal. So he will be asking Rabia some questions about serial. Next, we have Arun. Arun is a reporter and the host of WNYC's Micropolis series, an ongoing look at race, identity, and urban life. He has also contributed to or been a guest on NPR, the PBS NewsHour, Salon, and the Wall Street Journal. He is a longtime SAJA member, but is several years behind his dues. That's it. CC's annual Countering Violence Extremism Conference, as well as a presenter at the Global Counterterrorism Forum on annual conference. That's a lot of countering violence and extremism. Please, a warm round of applause for all three of our guests.
All right, awesome. You want to get the show started?
Sure. Thank you all for being here. Before we get started, chatting a little bit, let's get a sense of the room here. I'm going to ask you some questions, and if you are going to raise your hand, keep it up. Keep your hand up until I say put it down. So raise your hand if you've listened to at least one episode of the Serial podcast. Okay.
That's good.
That's pretty good. Keep them up. Raise your hand if you've listened to the entire podcast. Okay, still pretty good. Okay, now, keep your hand up if, after everything you've heard, after everything you've thought about, and after everything you have struggled with, even though you weren't in the courtroom, keep your hand up if you think Adnan did it.
I see
Very
3,
interesting. For the
4.
people on the web, most of the hands, almost all
totally
the
not
hands went up
stressed
for
out.
watching
That's-
Serial, and I could literally count on one hand the number of hands that stay up, the number of hands of people who think Adnan did it. Okay, hands down. Thank you very much. Now,
What about Jay? Who thinks that Jay did it? Okay, a
Oh,
few
wow,
more hands.
okay.
It looks like Jay's not doing so well.
Okay, an interesting room. So why don't we get started?
All right, guys, thank you all for coming. As Sharaf said, we are lucky to have this sort of newfound celebrity in our midst. I think of her as this woman who has sort of indirectly launched the podcast itself, launched 1,000 think pieces, 5 million sort of vigilante amateur detectives across the internet, for better or worse. We'll get into that. It's because of Rabia Chaudry that I think a lot of us are really thinking about these issues, around the case, issues of criminal justice, the failings, and maybe sometimes, occasionally, the pros and cons, I suppose, of our criminal justice system, about journalism ethics, about storytelling itself. And I think given that this is a SAJA event and we are, many of us, journalists here, I think it's interesting to consider that the 3 protagonists in this story, Adnan, Heyman, and Jay, are all people of color. And I think that's been an interesting sort of a thread in the coverage in the last few months. I think even by episode 4 or 5, people were really questioning whether this was the right format, whether this is doing justice to these people and their stories, whether Sarah Koenig, as a white reporter, had any right to be exploring these issues, you know. And I think there are a lot of problems in some of that coverage, but I think it's also a lot of grist for the mill. And so I'd like to talk to Rabia and perhaps get some of your thoughts on that through this evening. Before we let Rabia introduce herself or ask her a little about her backstory, I think we can ask somebody who has spoken to her. So why don't we get Sarah herself to describe in a few words.
Rabia's 40. She's short and she's got a beautiful round face framed by hijab. She's adorable looking, but you definitely shouldn't mess with her. She's very smart and very tough, and she could crush you.
She will crush you. That's why there's some distance right over here.
That's right. Apparently, she actually threw a phone so violently against a wall today that it just disintegrated.
Thank you so much for sharing that, by the way.
It's all about transparency. All right, Rabia, why don't you go ahead? I think a lot of people obviously are very interested in not just hearing your thoughts about this case, but also knowing a little more about you. Why don't you just tell us a little about yourself, if you could, and your backstory, and we'll get into like how you know Adnan and family and the community and all that.
Okay, yeah, so first of all, thank you so much for everybody for being here, for SAJA for sponsoring this, for Sharaf for being like amazing. I'm like, there's no way he's gonna pull this together like in 5 days. And also for one of the most interesting and stressful opening exercises I've ever experienced, I think, about who do you think did it. So I'll tell you a little bit about my connection with Adnan. My family and his family meaning our parents and Adnan himself, they lived in the same subdivision that's very close to a major mosque in the Baltimore area. It's one of the biggest mosques in Maryland. It's heavily South Asian, Pakistani, and there's a lot of Pakistani families that live there. So Adnan grew up there. He grew up in that mosque. We moved to that area when my brother was in 9th grade. I was already in college, so I wasn't that connected to the community. I was doing my own thing. But my brother became best friends with Adnan. And so I would see Adnan at the house, and he'd hang out, and he was kind of a little brother to me. He doesn't have any sisters. So, and that was that, and so I knew Adnan since he was 13, 14 years old, about that age, and I knew his parents, well. His parents, auntie and uncle is how we call them. And so but I lived in Virginia, and I would come home every weekend, and I remember actually when Hey Min had disappeared, because every Friday I would arrive in Baltimore, and for weeks, like 4, 5, 6 weeks, I'd sit with my mother, we'd watch the local news, and they kept showing her picture that, this girl is still missing. And I knew she went to school with Adnan, but I didn't know a lot about the relationship, because, my brother wasn't gonna dish on his friends that, oh, so-and-so was dating so-and-so. That's not how we do in our communities. Until one weekend when I came to visit, and it was Adnan's picture that was on the television, that he had been arrested for the murder. So since that time, we have been there for the family, but also for Adnan. And he was 17 when he was arrested. It's been almost 16 years now. It'll be 16 years next month. And my family and I have been with him through the appeals, through the post-conviction, and through all of this.
So, you guys are friends. You've known each other quite a bit. I know we've obviously heard him. We've kind of sort of lived with him in a sense for all those weeks. But tell us a little more about him. What's he like?
Well, Adnan is, I would joke with my brother and say, you're gonna corrupt him. He's the sweetest kid I've ever met. He used to call my older daughter, who's now 17, she was 4 at the time, I don't know, 3 or 4, she was very young. And he would call her Bambi. And he has big, big eyes, and my older daughter has really big eyes. So I was like, oh, you guys look related. But he was just he was one of those, and maybe some of the kids don't like kids like this in the community because they're the ones all the aunties and uncles love, right? Oh, auntie, can I get this for you? Can I clean this up? So he was just very congenial, very sweet, very non-confrontational. And it was just the greatest shock that he would be arrested for something. It was just unreal. It's still unreal, all these years later. He was not, as a 17-year-old, a devoutly religious person, because how many 17-year-olds are? But he became one in prison, and I think soon after he was arrested, he started, he was raised in a very religious family, and I think all those things came back to him. They were a means of support, and Maryland, like a lot of states across the country, has very large percentage of Muslims in the prison. So he was suddenly surrounded by all these inmates who are Muslims, but were often people who had converted in prison. So when Adnan was arrested, he became at a very young age, kind of like the imam. Because he was a native Muslim, whereas a lot of the other inmates were not.
You're saying that mostly were immigrants who would or what?
Not immigrants, African Americans.
Okay, got it.
Yeah. About 80% of the inmates who are incarcerated, and I know because I work on these issues separately outside of this, are incarcerated are Muslim or African American. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times they convert after they're arrested. But they have very strong, kind of almost like an institution inside the prison system. They support each other. And Adnan that was kind of his support system.
So this picture, or this reality that you have of Adnan, of the nice Adnan, the friendly Adnan, the wide-eyed Adnan, the Adnan going to help all the uncles and aunties, the Adnan who in prison is befriending these new communities, it has been challenged in the many articles you talk about and the opinions of, well, here's a really smart, really manipulated two-world character where he's got his home life, then he has his other life. First, when people started coming up with these statements about the manipulative personality and the kind of double lives, first, how did you feel about that as someone who knows him personally? But then second, as someone who knows him personally, what's your response to that?
So this was not an idea that was, the reason this kind of got planted in the public psyche as we're listening to serials, because if I remember correctly, and I actually have only listened to it once, I gotta go back and listen to the whole series again. But during the trial, the prosecutor framed Adnan this way, that he's leading a double life, and this is a very nefarious double life. It means he's a liar. It means he can easily manipulate people. He manipulated his family. And that was really hard to listen to, obviously, sitting in a courtroom with him and his mother and his younger brother all those weeks. And just knowing Adnan, and also knowing, anybody who's grown up in these circumstances, as the child of especially South Asian immigrants, that this is kind of par for the course. A lot of kids are leading lives like this, and it's out of respect for their families. They don't want to put it in their face that, oh, by the way, I'm sleeping around and smoking weed. So they just, what teenager doesn't hide stuff from their parents, right? But then I think the really hard thing was at the sentencing, because a judge, Adnan hadn't spoken throughout the trial, really. The judge had never interacted with him, but then at sentencing, she didn't have to, but she decided not just to sentence him with the maximum sentence, but to say, by the way, you're a horrible manipulative person, you're still manipulating all these people who love you, and you thought you got away. It was a really devastating statement. But all these years later, it kind of had faded, and so when it emerged again, it was a bit of a kick in the stomach. And I'm shocked that I can't imagine that somebody would go up to, like, let's say somebody like you and say, your brother, he's a real manipulative, he's a psychopath. But this is literally like people feel very comfortable saying to me and to Adnan's brother and to my brother, who's like still close to him, that, oh, this is what we think of him. It's like, all right, well, screw you. I mean,
Well, so it's
that was pretty much my reaction, if you want my response.
So it's very interesting you raised that, because we took a poll of the room, and people have opinions here, and you have this podcast, and it's allowed people to rightly or wrongly shape an opinion, almost shape a mental relationship with someone like Adnan, and that kind of brings up all sorts of interesting questions, which I will defer to my colleague, the journalist, here about.
I am kind of curious about one thing, though, in terms of the whole Desi aspect of this, in terms of how it manifested. Was the community, I mean, I can't imagine, and we, of course, occasionally you have people in the community who are like, oh, did you hear? He's been sleeping around on his wife, and the breaking up and that kind of stuff. It's a sort of little thing, but in terms of something this severe, it's hard for me to understand how it would play out. Were people very quiet, or were they rallying to his defense and saying, like, this is how we take this on?
The community was, I think, in a real utter state of shock for a long time, and for multiple reasons. First, because they were being forced to sit through these proceedings, having no say and voice, as the prosecutor in the state framed the case as one of, like, a Muslim honor killing, right? And suggesting that this community that has packed the courtroom is the community that will support him if he tries to abscond the country. Like, these are the people who are going to say, we totally get it. We totally get why you killed her, so we'll help you out. So they're dealing with that. None of them, I think, believed that, because he had been raised in that community. They were definitely there because of his parents or pillars of the community. But I think one of the hardest things, and often what would happen is Adnan would be sitting with his attorney, and in the in the row right behind him would be his mother and younger brother, and his older brother really did not attend the trial, and his father, uncle, was just not able to. He just couldn't emotionally handle it. And then I would sit either next to them or behind them, and then there would be rows of community members, and they're listening as Hayes' diary is being read, and they're talking about the many different places that they slept together or smoked weed or this and that. And I would just look at the back of his head and the back of his mother's head, and it's such a, from our culture to be exposed like that, I think that was maybe one of the hardest things for his family. Although obviously losing your child to something like this, a wrongful conviction, is one thing, but the utter humiliation of that is hard to live down. So the community had to deal with it, and I think it made them wonder about their own kids, like, what are y'all doing too? And I know that, I heard it many times, that there were parents who would say, well, see, this is what happened. You did this, we tell you this is not part of our culture, there's a reason. You get caught up in this, and this is, his punishment, in a way.
Oh, my. So let's talk about the journalism itself in terms of Serial. Let's back up a bit, though. You approach Sarah, who you had an existing relationship with. Is that correct?
No, I didn't know Sarah at all.
At all. You just came out to her out of the blue because she had already, in the past, been involved with this.
Yeah, I had been following the documentaries and the story about the West Memphis 3. And one night, and this was after the post-conviction appeal had been filed, we had had a hearing. And this was the hearing, for people who are paying attention to what's going on now, this is the hearing at which the prosecutor from the trial testified and said that he basically lied under oath and said that Asia had been forced to make these documents. So that had happened, and I realized that day that I didn't think, we were waiting for the judge's order, but I thought, we're not going to win this. We've lost Asia. She was a big part of the post-conviction. So anyhow, I got done watching the West Memphis 3 thing, and I thought it was like 2 a.m., and I was like, we have to get media involved. And I had talked to Adnan many times about this in the past, and we, for strategic reasons, didn't do it. And I thought, now, this is it. This is like, Asia was our ace. We have lost Asia. There's nowhere to go but up. And so I thought, I'll look for a Baltimore Sun reporter who covered the case 15 years ago and maybe is still still really close to the Baltimore journalism community and knows the judges and is in the weeds and the crime reporting. But anyhow, I Googled and I found Sarah, and I emailed her that night because she had written 15 years ago about Gutierrez, his attorney, and she contacted me like literally the next day. And when she contacted me, I kind of felt a little bit of regret because I'm like, she works in radio. I mean, like, what's a one radio show gonna do for us? So I really wanted somebody who's like local and is gonna dig and expose the junk that's happened. I'm like, she's gonna do a 1 hour This American Life show. But you know, it is what
Some
it is.
quirky thing.
Yeah.
A bunch of hipsters are going to hear.
I had never listened to it before. I didn't know who she was. I didn't know what a big deal she was. And even after I met her, she's so unassuming, and she totally is like very hippie. I'm like, oh my God, I just gave like this woman like a bunch of documents, and I don't even know where, you know, what's going to happen to this. So it was, but you know, it was in a way meant to be. And this happened in 2013. So in 2010, when his post-conviction petition had been filed, and I didn't realize this until a few months ago, his lawyer actually had cited Sarah's article. So Sarah Koenig's name and article appears in Adnan's post-conviction from 2010. So that's not a coincidence. That was like meant to be, I think, you know.
So 2013, take us into the timeline where this really starts becoming a relationship, you and her.
So it was, I think, October 2013 is when we first met. I think it was October. We met the first time, and that's actually in the first episode. That was our first meeting, which you guys heard my brother and me talking in that episode. We gave her a few documents. She said, I'll take a look at this. A couple weeks later, she said, I want to see more. So we took her to Adnan's house, his mother's house, and you know, the dozens of boxes were there. I gave her stuff. And after a couple weeks, she's like, yeah, I'm interested in this. I want to keep pursuing it. But I didn't really know what she was doing, or, you know, I knew it would take a long time to get just through the documents. And then it wasn't until about, I think, January 2014 or so that she called me and said, I just talked to Asia McClain. And I was like, what? Because we thought Asia was gone, you know. So that was when I realized she was really in. And then she told me, we've hired some other staff people. I've got a team working on this. And I'm like, wow, this is crazy. So
it was 1 year ago when you realized that this was sort of something special.
It was happening. I still thought it was going to be a 1 hour This American Life show, though. I didn't know it was going to be a series until maybe about a month before it aired.
And when that happened, and I guess by this point you must have been in regular contact with Sarah. Not really.
No. She established that, you know, you brought me the case, but this is my story. This is my investigation early on. The episode about Route Talk, I was right there in Baltimore, so she's like, I'm coming down with Dana. We're going to do this drive. And I was like, oh, that's great. I'll go with you. And she's like, no, you won't go with me. This is my thing. That's when I realized.
Back off.
Right. Now, that's when I realized that, this is not. And it took a while for me to realize that she wasn't out to exonerate Adnan. She was out to just find the truth because she felt something was wrong here. So she really, it was only when things were like really, could legally impact his case, she would contact us, you know, or Adnan's lawyer and say, listen, this is going on, I want to turn this over to you or something. Otherwise, I had no idea who she interviewed. I didn't know what her conclusions were. I didn't know a lot of what was going on.
You know, I remember the first episode or two, you know, I'm just maybe tuning in or like downloading the This American Life podcast, and they're like, oh, check out Serial. And we're like, all right, sure, sounds kind of quirky, something, whatever. And maybe by episode 3 or so, we were like, wow, a lot of people seem to be listening to this thing. I'm just wondering about your experience. Were you like all of us in terms of you're like, wow, this is kind of interesting. I'm not sure where this is going. A lot of my friends seem to be sharing this on Facebook or whatever it is.
Yeah, I think it was the second week when I realized, because in the first week they dropped 2 episodes, second week they dropped 2 episodes, and I think by the second week I realized that this is getting created, because a subreddit had been created by then, and so all these sleuths had already started diving into it, and after the first week, had started, I wanted to immediately respond to some things that were in the episode, so I had a blog, I started writing on the blog about it, and I hadn't planned that. And I can't remember when, I think it was just when the Reddit went on, and then the media started contacting us, you know, when I started getting lots and lots of messages, media requests, and I think that was maybe in the 3rd or 4th week. I'm like, wow, and then the Rolling Stone covered it, and Guardian, it was everywhere, and nobody could have predicted that. Sarah certainly didn't think it was going to be that big either.
So you said something interesting just a few minutes ago, and that was that you realized that Sarah wasn't there to exonerate Adnan. Sarah was there to find the truth about what happened. I read in there that you were hoping when you brought the reporter on board that you'd bring on a reporter who would do something to help exonerate Adnan. So when you see someone kind of take this story that you brought to them and take it in the direction that they want to go in, and maybe it's not in where you want it to land, what is that like? Where's your sense of ownership, or do you say, okay, look, whatever comes of this, let it be?
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't, it was like kind of the price you have to pay for this, right? I mean, and the thing is, when I contacted Sarah, like I said, it was like the middle of the night, I didn't ask Adnan, I didn't ask his family, I just made a unilateral decision. And then I talked to them and I said, listen, this is the thing. Like, there's nothing to lose at this point, right? Let's say that this reporter comes in and finds something that makes you look really bad. Oh, well, you are serving maximum sentence. Like, what's gonna, like, and Adnan's real concern was his family going through all of it again and having his, the private life and all the things he had been involved in. Just, he's like, I don't want to expose my family to that again, my mother especially to that again. So I went to his mom. I said, let me talk to your mom. I went to his mom. And this is before Sarah had contacted him. So she still had to get his permission. But I had already begun speaking to her. And I went to Adnan's mom and I said, this is the one thing that Adnan said is stopping him, that he doesn't want you to be hurt all over again. And his mom said, she's like, there's nothing more painful for me than the fact that my son has not been in my, in my home in 6 to 15 years. And she said, I don't care what it takes, do it. So, we had their blessing and we did it. But, we all realized it. And it's been, I think, the one episode where they talk about Adnan's 18-page letter, I think that was like his just release of, I spent months and months talking to you. Are you a friend? Are you an enemy? Are you an ally? What the hell are you, Sarah? Moment. And I've had a couple of moments like that. We've had fights. I've had fights with Sarah. And then I have to keep being like, okay, she has no reason to put her reputation on the line for someone like Adnan. She's done as much as she could. She really did. But I did hope that she would find a smoking gun, something that would exonerate. In her quest for the truth, she would find something that would clearly exonerate him. That was what I wanted.
What do you think she found?
I mean, look, a year ago, this case was close to dead in the water. We had filed a new petition for like a new post-conviction, It had very low chances. And Sarah's investigation and the show and the results of that show, have made a tremendous impact. Sarah has, brought the Innocence Project onto it. And we had failed in all these years to get them interested in the case. They discovered physical evidence that had been never tested for DNA. Nobody realized. All his lawyers in 15 years didn't realize this. Asia McClain's back. And Asia McClain is back because if you guys, I don't know, have followed, she's submitted a new affidavit because Asia started listening to Serial. And she did not know what Kevin Urich had said. She also did not know on what basis Adnan had been convicted. She was told by the prosecutor that it was a really solid case against him. There's no way, there's no room here for error. Like, he did it. And she believed him until she heard the podcast. And then she went back to Sarah and said, I need to be back in this because this is not true. Like, this guy told me not to testify, and I made those documents of my own free will. So, I mean, these are major, major things. So they've brought the post-conviction back to life. And then we have the Innocence Project that's working on a separate legal track. And then we have a bajillion internet sleuths that come up with amazing theories. And one of the most amazing ones, and I honestly really believe if somebody's going to solve this case, it's going to be Susan Simpson. I don't know. How many people here are reading Susan Simpson's blog? Okay, more of you need to be reading her blog. It's called The View from LL2, and she is amazing. She's remarkable. She has examined, I've given her all the documents that I had, and she's examining the testimony and the evidence in a whole, I don't know, her brain just works in a whole different way. And she's pointed things out that nobody had even picked up in all these years. So,
So we're going to come back in
Okay.
a little bit to some of what do we do with those positive things that have happened. But there's other impacts too. Presumably there have been some negative impacts. What are some of the other tougher impacts that have been the collateral effect of this type of attention?
I think the most, Actually, maybe not, I would say maybe the only really negative thing that's come out of this is it's been really hard on his younger brother. It has been very, very hard on Yusuf. And Yusuf was 9 years old when Adnan was arrested. And he immediately began getting picked on at school. He had gotten fights at school. You know, kids were saying, your brother's a murderer. And he got kicked out, you know, suspended from schools. So his parents eventually sent him to Pakistan. They sent him to a madrasa in Karachi. And because they didn't know really like what to do with him. And this is a kid who is like, knows nothing about the language, the culture, has never been there before, and he's just dropped there, right? Away from his parents, away from the family. And then when he's come back, like 5-6 years ago, he's still in tremendous pain. It's really hard for him. It's really, really hard for him to see people talk about Adnan on the internet in a really negative way. He's really, he has some times when he's coping very badly. And even with Sarah. So, you know, I keep having to explain to him that, you know, our expectation of Sarah is that she would do, you know, an in-depth investigation, not that she would get your brother out of jail. And, you know, he was hoping, and we all wished, obviously, as people who love Adnan, that she would, at the episode 12, be like, I totally believe he didn't do it, this guy needs, you know, you know, that would have been great. It didn't happen, and that was hard for him.
I mean, for me, that was one of the major disappointments was the way it ended. I felt like maybe I sort of saw it coming, but the sort of on the one hand, on the other hand kind of approach. And I'm wondering if you thought that it could have been a more sort of coherent or rather a focused sort of a drive, maybe something that wasn't 12 weeks, not the serial approach, or maybe like, would you have preferred a different way of explaining this so it was tighter and people had a very clear sense of what happened, what didn't happen?
I don't know if the story could have been told in a more, maybe, yeah, in a more concise format. It really didn't, and I think, you know, over the years, even people who knew Adnan growing up, I would like meet people at dinner party, I'd be like, talking about the case, and you know, people totally forgot about the case after a couple of years, and a lot of people had no idea. Like a lot of the kids he grew up, because the kids at school that he went to school with were told, do not contact him. Like you're not allowed to contact him. The principal, vice principal, teacher said that. So they didn't even know like on what basis he had been convicted. So when I would talk to them later, I'd be like, well, it's really complicated. This weird guy found this body and it didn't make sense. And this, like, and I would try to, and there were so many layers of it that people were like, okay, basically, you know, you're so in favor of Adnan, you're just kind of biased. Like everything is weird to you. So I think Sarah had to take a long time to tell a very complex story. And I think that was right. At the very end, though, I knew, because again, if there was anything that would have had a legal impact on Adnan, she has been amazing at immediately turning it over to the lawyer. So I knew that didn't exist. I just wondered if she would be a little more definitive about her conclusion about Adnan. But I'm at least thankful that she said, if I was in that courtroom, I would not have convicted him. You know, I would have acquitted.
I mean, it's a spectacle like we haven't seen. I mean, at least not in my lifetime. But there is something to the word I think that she's had to defend against is an entertainment. You know, and I saw something that you had been in a conversation on Huffington Post, and it was a video interview, I think, or something talking about you. And in the sidebar, I saw this link to another story, and it said, "Guy live blogs his wife's affair, and it's better than a soap opera." And it just kind of made me wonder when she defends this and says it's never been an entertainment to her, but obviously to many listeners, that's exactly what it is. And I was just wondering how you reconciled these two things.
I mean, you know, I know that Sarah, I mean, first of all, she has incredible integrity, and she's very, like, seriously committed to the case, not just been about the show. I mean, she's still committed to the case. She's still connected and said, I'm not walking away from this, you know. But having said that, you know, obviously, I understand there's a utility to the entertainment. If she had told the story in a really boring way, nobody would have cared. We needed the entertainment value of it to get people's attention, for better or worse. What I thought was really interesting is that, you know, a number of people have said that they listened to the whole thing and thought it was fiction, that it was people acting it out. And I thought that was crazy. I thought that was crazy. So it is it's entertaining in the way the real life can be. And I mean, in other words, you know, there's a lot of elements of it, from the Romeo and Juliet stuff to the ethnic stuff to to Jay and Mr. S and these weird characters. I mean, yeah, it totally could be fiction, and life is sometimes stranger than fiction. So it is hard sometimes when people are kind of like make light of it, but at the same time, I know we need it. We need the entertainment value.
It's sort of, you can't have one without the other, the huge popularity.
I mean, she could have done a great investigation, done a solid piece of journalism, and nobody cared because it was boring.
Right.
Right? So, yeah.
So Jay, what is the deal with Jay?
Jay got a great deal. Jay got a great deal. He totally undermined that deal with his interview with The Intercept, because his plea deal requires him to be truthful. You know, he basically admitted to committing perjury in the trial. What is his deal is, I don't know. I'll be honest. I mean, a lot of people, if you had asked me 3 or 4 episodes into the show, like, you know, what's his deal, I would have said to you that I think he was responsible. I mean, like for 15, 16 years, that's where my like heart has been. I don't know so much anymore because there seem to be indications that Jay might not have known a thing. There are cases in which, you know, police have fed, you know, total information to witnesses or to people who then somehow just say, okay, they accept it. They get railroaded into it. And so I wonder. I mean, I feel like now, and there's certain things that I can't even talk about, but that even that's a possibility. And I feel like it's gotten even fuzzier. So whereas before, you know, and this is about like what actually happened to Hay. I don't know I now feel like we might not ever know the truth. Like that's how I feel about it.
Has that fuzziness shaken your own resolve regarding Adnan's innocence?
No, it hasn't. I mean, honestly, this whole experience to me has just kind of reconfirmed the fact that, you know, that he's innocent. I mean, from her, you know, interviewing like his friends, I mean, like everything she could, there's just, you know, the fact that, I mean, that's what reasonable doubt means, right? There has to be some doubt. So definitely in a court of law, I think, even people who think maybe he did it, but they wouldn't convict. But to me, I know who Adnan is as a person. I saw him as a kid. I saw how shaken and terrified he was. And that's just not him.
So, reasonable doubt. This term that we have in our legal system that people will debate over, that there's a question of, do folks even really understand what it means? Did the prosecution prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt? So, counselor, the state has argued that Adnan Syed is guilty. The state's argued that he had a clear motive because he was the scorned ex-boyfriend. Counselor, the state has pointed to a mountain of evidence. The testimony of Jay, the cell phone records, and scores of other material. So they've rested. Counselor, please, I present to you the jury. In 2 minutes or less, tell us why the state has not proven its case beyond a reasonable doubt.
You can start with motive. The motive, first of all, okay, fine, you want to say that he was a jilted ex-boyfriend. You have to provide some proof of a pattern or some evidence from anybody, a witness, a friend, somebody close to Hay, somebody close to Adnan who said that he actually felt like that. Beyond that, I have 4 girls here he's been seeing. I don't know what he's been doing with them, but he's been seeing them for the last few months. So that, I mean, he wasn't that broken up about it. There's evidence, even in his call log, that the most phone calls he made was to this new girl, Nisha. This is his new love interest. He's shown no signs of it. So there's been no pattern other than the fact that he's a Muslim male, which is what you're arguing, which is, by the way, unconstitutional.
Not me, I'm the
right.
judge. That's the state. Okay.
Okay. Yeah. So, you know, there's that. In terms of the cell phone evidence, this is the first case in Maryland ever to use this type of evidence, which, by the way, later in other jurisdictions has been thrown out. But also, your cell phone tower expert didn't ever even test dialing out of the burial site. So, you know, 2 of your 13 pings matched Jay's story, which, by the way, has changed 4 times, and we have it on record from the first trial to his 3 police statements. So from 2 out of your 13 pings matched, but even those 2 pings were not from Lincoln Park, so you have not shown me that that cell phone evidence means anything at all. Now, in 2015, because Jay now says that the burial took place at midnight, well, your cell phone evidence means crap now, nothing. It's totally useless. So let's go back to trial. Let's do this.
Now can we do this? So you have these new things that have come up because of Serial that you were alluding to before. We've got Asia McClain back on the scene, written, signed, sworn document. We've got Jay talking to reporters, furthering the inconsistencies. We have new science and better knowledge regarding cell phone tower pings and how they work. What good is it to us now, legally?
So you want me to talk a little bit about procedurally where we are right now?
Yeah, what's happening with the case, and what good is this new information, or is it just making us feel like, oh man, we missed the boat?
Well, we did, a lot of boats were missed, a lot of balls were dropped, that's for sure, but we have a chance now that's really, really strong, basically like the best chance we have at post-conviction that we've ever had before.
Explain what post-conviction is.
Okay, so after a trial, and if somebody's convicted, that person has the opportunity to file what's called direct appeals. Direct appeals challenge rulings, legal, and I'm not a litigator, so you correct me if I'm wrong, but direct appeals will challenge rulings that happen at trial. So for example, if Cristina Gutierrez had objected, and the judge ruled on that objection, and on direct appeal, you can say, well, the judge ruled wrong. So you're basically like appealing kind of legal technicalities. You cannot on direct appeal say, oh, I suddenly got some new evidence. That new evidence can only be raised in something called a post-conviction appeal. And strategically, what we decided to do was exhaust his direct appeals, basically get as many shots as we could, at this, then go to post-conviction. At post-conviction, we raised the new evidence that Asia existed, that his lawyer never contacted her. Basically all the, that Adnan had talked about a plea, and I'm sure you probably want to talk about that. And that basically evidence that Gutierrez had failed him as an attorney. And this was something that could never have been raised in direct appeal. So he had to wait till post-conviction. We lost the post-conviction about a year ago. We got a ruling against us. And immediately his lawyer filed a petition to allow us to basically just get a new post-conviction. And it was really procedural. There was very little, we didn't really think it's going to work, but then things started happening, Not only the show happened, but the Court of Special Appeals took interest in one issue, and that issue specifically was about the plea. And there's two issues in the post-conviction. One is the plea, one is Asia McClain. And the plea issue they're interested in because there's some precedent in Maryland that's been established in this time. So they were like, okay, we want to kind of hear the state on this. Now, between that time, that was back last August, I think. Between that time and now, a lot has happened. And so Adnan's lawyer waited for the state to respond, then immediately filed an addition to that application saying, oh, Asia's back, we have a new application, we want to bring her back to life. And we have now we have evidence that the lead prosecutor lied under oath, so it totally undermined the integrity of the actual post-conviction.
So the post-conviction is one way of saying you've got your trial and your appeals, which is you on trial, but then post-conviction is what we call a collateral tax, saying the process itself was flawed. Even as you went through trial to Supreme Court of the state, the process. So I'm challenging the process.
He did not get a
So Adnan's lawyers have challenged, I'm challenging the process because Adnan did not have effective counsel. He has a constitutional right to effective counsel, and Christina was not legally effective. And then there was a challenge because of maybe prosecutorial misconduct. There was a challenge because this new evidence means that his trial was almost effectively rendered unfair, and we need to introduce this. But the state has just come in recently and said, no. This Asia McClain affidavit, not an issue on the table. Too late to bring it up. Is it too late, or can it still be put in front of a judge to look at and say, yeah, maybe he does need to get a new trial?
Yeah, so the state filed a motion to strike the amendment that raised all these new things. And I personally think it's one of the lamest motions I've seen. It's very brief. It's a couple of pages. It has no precedent cited. It's not a very strong motion, I would say. I think that there's case precedent on our side in this issue, but we have to wait for the court to rule. Look, if the court rules To
Right,
grant,
what happens?
yeah, the court can go to it. It can rule to grant the motion, in which case all of the stuff that has been new, the additional stuff, Asia's new affidavit, Urich's lying, that can't be considered. But the underlying application, which the court still wanted to hear on the plea issue, can still be considered. But if the court dismisses the motion, then all of it gets to be seen in front of the court. And then we wait for the order. We wait to see what the appellate court says, and that could take months, a year, you never know.
I guess even taking it to just a more general level, right now in the courts, what's the definition of success? It's not the court saying, you know, Mr. Syed, here's your get out of jail card. Like what's the best that can happen?
The best that can happen for us is that the court decides to remand the case for a new trial.
Right.
That's what we want. Because I am confident if they do that, the state is going to say, oh my God, we cannot try this case again. Because they don't have a lot left for their case.
Too much time has passed.
No, forget that. Jay's useless. Jay's testimony is useless. The cell phone evidence is useless. What is left?
And so what would then, you know, and I don't know if you can talk about this, but
Yeah.
what would the options be? If the court says that this was an unfair trial, soup to nuts, and Mr. Syed's rights were violated and he's entitled to a new trial, so state deal with it, does that mean, and if the state doesn't have enough to try the case, does that mean he's out? Does that mean it would be a plea negotiation? What would happen?
I think in situations like that, I mean, this is basically just what I'm hoping, that the state can go two ways. They could drop the charges, but that's highly unlikely. I mean, like, you know, why would they do that after, you know, all this time and money spent? But what they'll do is sometimes offer something called an Alford plea, which has happened in a lot of other wrongful convictions. And it's kind of a sad situation where they say to this person, okay, well, we're sorry we locked you up for how many years wrongfully, but take this Alford plea, which is a plea that says, I'm guilty, but I'm not guilty, and we'll let you go time served. Now, from the case's perspective, from the state's perspective, the case is kind of closed. This person still did it. He's not legally exonerated. They're probably never going to look for who actually did it. That's the end of the, you know, the end of what happened to Hay. But Adnan he would be a felon. He would be a convicted felon, but he could be released, you know, on that plea.
I know that there's lots of questions out there. Sharaf, do you want to direct it to something from online, or is there somebody here you want to direct us to?
What I'll do is we'll start questions here first. Let me get in front of the camera. 1 second.
It's all about the camera.
It's all about the camera. How you doing? We're going to start with questions in the room first. We are curating questions online. Please use the hashtag SAJA, S-A-J-A serial, S-E-R-I-A-L. Probably know how to spell that. S-A-J-A serial, and we are gathering questions online at the moment. And first question, again, please, a question, no comments, no stories, no epics, nothing like that. So please, just a question.
Unless you have the smoking gun.
Unless you have the smoking gun. We're going to start right here first.
How does Adnan feel about the case in the story up to this point, and how would you characterize his level of optimism at ultimately getting out?
I mean, I think I have never seen Adnan stressed out before until this happened. Like really, in all these years, whatever ups and downs, and I'm sure he's gone through a lot of really difficult times in prison. He literally grew up in prison in a way. But it wasn't until this show started, and even though he couldn't listen to it, he's getting letters, and I think his relationship with Sarah was really hard on him, because he doesn't understand, like, how do you open yourself up to somebody who's like, I think you might have killed somebody, you know what I mean? Like, it's, so it's been hard, but at the same time, he, you know, says over and over, I'm so grateful, I'm so grateful. He knows that it has given new life to his case. He's very measured in terms of his hopes for success. I mean, just about a week, 10 days ago, he said to me that, listen, you know, I know that if the state keeps pushing back on everything we're doing, you know, if we lose a post-conviction and then we have to do another post-conviction and we have to, you know, because it could keep going, you know, we could lose the post-conviction. He's like, I recognize that it might still take 3, 4, 5, 6 years, and he's like, I'll be patient. And, you know, I was like, God, he'll be almost 40 at that point, you know, like, for me, I'm like, I don't know why, I want him home in his 30s. At least I want him to have his 30s. But me, my brother, and his mom and younger brother went to see him, like, I think, in the week or two after the show began. And we were really excited about, like, all the attention, or like the whole world's watching, everybody thinks you're innocent. And even then, he was like, this is great. He's like, alhamdulillah, this is great. He's like, but I want you to realize that there have been cases that have had a lot of attention and nothing's happened for them. So don't, he has lost hope over and over again. For us, Asia McClain was, like, for 15 years, the great hope, right? And so it's hard for him to be really too positive about it.
Rabia, just to take that one step further, there's been criticism, because everyone's got an opinion about this, about, man, this guy Adnan, I don't know. I'd be angry if I was in his shoes. I'm not hearing the anger. I'm not hearing the emotion. I'm just hearing this measured voice, this cool as a cucumber guy who's talking about, making pancakes in the, kitchen of the jail. And through the Serial podcast, for whatever tape sessions we were allowed to hear, there is something to that. And so people were feeling that the emotion wasn't there in ways that people were feeling that emotion, that anger, that curiosity, that drive. So what context can you give to that? How do you respond to those critiques?
There's so many answers to that question. First of all, we heard really a fraction of his communications with Sarah. I don't know what the other 40 hours of his talks with her were like. So it's very possible that we did not hear some really important things. And the reason I know that is because there were times when she played a clip of him, and I'm like, then I would talk to him and be like, oh my God, she played this clip. Why did you, about Gutierrez specifically, where he said, well, she was like my mother and my father and my everything. And I'm like, we've got an ineffective assistance of counsel claim, what the hell? And he's like, no. He's like, that wasn't my full, he's like, every time I've talked about Gutierrez, I've told her that my relationship with her was like this, but I had no idea what was going on. I didn't know how she was treating my family. I didn't know her demands for money. I didn't know she wasn't using the money for the things she said. I didn't know she never contacted agents. So he had explained this, but we didn't hear that in the podcast. And so I know that Sarah was selective about, and I talked to her about it. She's like, well, it's editorial discretion. I'm like, whatever, you gotta tell the whole story. So there might be things that he said. The second thing I'll say is this, look, I don't think it is a safe place to be in a maximum security prison and to be talking about people. I think you just don't know, like, who's, you know what I mean? Like, in terms of his safety and security. Because the guards are listening to the show. People are reporting on it, and the printed material is getting to the inmates, like newspapers and magazines and stuff. So there's also that element. But then the third element is, like, that's kind of just not who he is. He's also, like, a really religious person. He's also just very kind of measured. He spends most of his time talking to you, when he talks to you, saying, how are you? What's happening with you? I'm so sorry this happened with you. So there's a lot of reason, but there could, and what happened was I had turned all the documents over to Sarah, and then they had put them in electronic format and given them to me in a USB. And I had discovered, and it was probably by accident, a couple of letters that Adnan had written to Sarah early on when they first communicated that were on that USB. And one of them, he was very clear. He was like, he talked about his relationship with Hay, he talked about how he felt when she died, he talked about, all these things that people have said, we never heard him say these things. So I emailed Sarah, I said, I know you're gonna say no, but can I share this letter on my blog? And she's like, no. So I didn't, but I am talking about it, not all of it. But the point is that there are lots of things he probably talked to her about, and maybe she'll bring them up later. I think she might do a follow-up.
Given how compelling, a lot of people found him and, articulate, I'm curious about there's somebody who said, this is on the Marshall Project, which is a website which specializes in criminal justice coverage. And there's somebody by the name of Erica Zunkel. She's from University of Chicago's Federal Criminal Justice Clinic. She said she didn't find him, she found him not guilty, and she found him so compelling that she was curious why he was not put on the stand. And I'm wondering if you had any thoughts about that in retrospect.
Oh, that was Gutierrez's choice. He had asked if he could be put on the stand. He wanted to testify.
He wanted to be, okay.
He did. Mm-hmm. But you don't defer to a 17-year-old who's never been in the system, who has no idea. So, when he told us that, I want to, but she's saying no, we're like, listen to your lawyer. You're like, you don't. And I was in law school at the time. I knew nothing about this. I still don't know very little. I've never practiced criminal law. But generally speaking, a lot of criminal defense attorneys say, we don't put our clients on the stand because, and one good example is if he was put on the stand And the prosecutor asked him, like, how did you feel after you broke up with Hay? If he said, well, I was really hurt, that plays against it. But if he said, I was totally fine, that also, she's dead. I mean, like, so there are ways that, there are reasons it doesn't strategically make sense. So I think, she probably did the right thing.
Let's take another question.
We're going to take a question from Twitter. So.
Yes, so Elizabeth Jane tweeted in, Rabia, do you wish Adnan had better recollection about where he was, what he did all that day?
Yeah, so this is also a bit of a fallacy, the idea that he has no idea what he did that day. I mean, there are numerous documents in the files that show him with his own hands taking notes of what he remembers from early that morning. Around what time he would have went to drop off the thing and what periods he attended and then going to track practice. And he actually remembers seeing Asia. And when Asia contacted him, it was in March, end of March. So a number of months had passed since Hay had died. So he got the letters, he's like, oh yeah, I totally remember this conversation I had with her. But he could not independently say that was definitely on the 13th. He was like, I think it might have, she thinks it is. And so he asked his lawyer to corroborate it. Now, where things got fuzzy for him was after track practice, and he said that. He's like, I smoked something, and we heard how he was literally slumped over, in Kathy's place. He's like, I smoked something, and I don't remember a lot of, but I know that I was supposed to go to the mosque, the masjid, because it was the second or the third to the last night of Ramadan, which if you're Muslim, that's a big deal. If your family is especially very, very religious, you need to be at the mosque. You better show up at least once. So he had a routine in Ramadan that he would pick up food, go to see his dad, pray these Ramadan prayers. And the day after, on the 14th, he was slated to give a lecture, an Islamic lecture to the kids. And so he remembers that. And there's notes that were taken from his room that he made for that lecture. So that is actually one way that we know that one of the people from the mosque actually in the grand jury testified that he's like, I saw him the night before and I went over the notes with him so he could do it the next day. But that person was never put on the stand either, and I don't know why Gutierrez didn't call him. And that's part of the problem. Her defense lasted less than a day, while the prosecution's case lasted 5 weeks.
Next question.
Another hands for questions. We're going to go.
As a journalist, is Sarah known to be a storyteller, or is it her first attempt? Because I was mesmerized by her storytelling. Facts of the case on one side, but the way she weaved the story, the way she spoke. Is it her first attempt in the radio, or she does it quite often and we have just discovered it, or I have just discovered her?
Yeah, she's been, I guess, I don't know her personally, I don't know too much of her biography or anything, but I think, and anybody can correct me if they want to, that she's been with the show This American Life for quite some time as a producer, and they're, some of the best in the business. But this was an unusual exercise. Nobody has done this particular way of storytelling.
Yeah, but even not just as a producer, but she also has reported many stories with This American Life. Now I've gone back and listened to This American Life. But yeah, and she is really just good at storytelling. So she'll take things that I normally, I'll look at the title and I'm like, that's not really that interesting. But when you listen to it, she makes it very compelling. She also has a great voice, so that kind of keeps you hooked. So no, she did not come to this as a novice. She was a pro.
Another question?
We're going to go back to Twitter.
So we have a question from Anum Khan. What will happen if the post-conviction trial doesn't exonerate or release Adnan? What's next? Is that the last try?
It's not the last try because in Maryland, you can file a new post-conviction based on new evidence. Okay, so every time you have new evidence, you can file for a new post-conviction. And you can also post-convict the lawyer you have currently if he missed something, right? So now what we have is we have this physical evidence that exists that has not been tested for DNA. If it gets tested, that would be another reason that we could, get back in court before a judge. And beyond that, we are kind of on the verge right now of offering a reward for money, a reward for new information, and you just don't know, in the next few months or year, who might just step up and say something and decide to offer something. Because I really believe that there are people who know what actually happened, and there are people who are connected to the story but have not spoken in all these years. And if that happens and some new evidence comes, we can get back in front of a judge.
All right, we're going to go to a question from the audience right here.
In speaking about Adnan and what he said and what we actually heard in his conversations with Sarah, I'm wondering, you said something that piqued my interest, that you're not telling the whole story. After listening to it, do you feel like the whole story was told?
I don't think Sarah could tell the whole story. I mean, even for legal reasons. I mean, there are things that I know she could not air because of like defamation issues, legal. I mean, I'll give you an example. We never heard on the story, like a lot of people independently went and looked up Jennifer Pusateri's criminal records and Jay's criminal records, but these were not mentioned on the show, right? So there's a lot of things, so she had to draw lines somewhere. But also, she had to respect that these people were also sources and potential sources of the future, so she's got to keep those lines of communication open. She's not going to throw them under the bus. One thing I feel strongly, though, and I felt this is like kind of maybe another negative thing, but not really because I think we can remedy it, is that I feel like in all of this, I still feel like Adnan's voice was not really heard. So through the trial, he never got a chance to speak. And here he was at the mercy of Sarah and editorial discretion as to what is heard and what's not heard. And people really haven't heard him yet. They don't know who he is, what his story is, what he's experienced, how he felt about Hay. What it was like to be hauled out of bed at 5 a.m. as a 17-year-old and taken down to central booking. So I think there are opportunities to do that. I'm exploring ways to do that, to be able to for him to finally get a chance, because just think about living a life like that where you never get to tell people your story, but you have to sit back and listen to others tell it. It can't be easy.
Does he want to?
Yeah, he does. He does. And what happened was when I started blogging, because I didn't plan it. I was thinking I'm going to write this really beautiful long form essay about my, the case and Adnan and then my involvement, and maybe submit it to the Atlantic or something like that. But as soon as the show started happening, I was like, I have to respond immediately. I don't think Serial folks were that happy about it. I don't think they're, because all of a sudden, but their story got hijacked by all kinds of people, not just me. All kinds of people started jumping in and taking over the story. But I did ask Adnan, after I sent him my first 3 or 4 blog posts. I said, listen, I'm doing this because I'm bothered that there are all kinds of, context is not, fully given and things are left out. And he called me and he was like, thank you for doing it, please continue to do it. You're my voice. I have no other way to, do this, so.
I mean, I think what you're saying about Adnan is an interesting and it's correct in terms of how much do we really get a sense. As much time as we may have heard him on the air, there's so many things that we don't know about him, which we deserve to know. Of course, the absence of Hae Min and her family, rather, is, I think, you could go on for weeks without realizing, wait a minute, we have no idea what their side is like, which I think is, of course, a huge problem for any sort of journalistic exercise. But, I mean, anybody who's a journalist knows that in terms of trying to get the whole story, even if you report on something for a day or two, there's a fraction of the material that the interviews that you're using. Forget a deep dive like this. Even 12 weeks, you're spending, I don't know, documentary makers may spend it's like a 40-1 ratio perhaps, maybe much higher than that, the amount of footage you get and what tiny amount you actually can represent on there. So, I mean, it's sort of just the nature of the beast, I think.
Oh yeah, I mean, I didn't expect her to do 1,000 hours on this and put everything out there. I mean, it has to be interesting. People have to stay interested. And anytime there was a little bit of a slower episode, all of a sudden there was this crazy reaction. Oh, I was so bored. It's like, oh my God, you lost 15 minutes of your time. Who cares? Just relax. This is somebody's life. So yeah, I mean, I get that. I get that. But that's why people like me and Susan Simpson and other people writing about it are important to tell the rest of it, because this is not entertainment. There's a lot of real stuff that's happened and is still happening, in fact.
Well, it's like this national education in the legal system, isn't it? Another question?
I got a question right here.
Rabia, I actually have a question for you. As someone who's not only a friend of Adnan's, but also a lawyer, how do you feel putting such a personal story out there? And how have you, I guess to be more specific, what has been your experience interacting with not only journalists, but also people in general who are interested in a story that you feel you know so much more about?
I mean, look, there's been the trolls, and there have been my regretful Twitter moments. But beyond that, I am amazed at the way people are investing themselves in this case. Like, I get messages from people that are pages and pages long. I have this theory. I'm going to tell you my timeline. You know, people who are writing, not just writing letters, you know, over and over to Adnan, people who have sent him money in envelopes, like they're stuffing envelopes with money and just mailing it to him. You know, we've raised almost $85,000, you know. Almost 30,000 people have signed the petition, which, by the way, please sign his petition. It's at change.org. So to me, the response is overwhelming and overwhelmingly positive. And there are certain forums where you hear, you know, kind of like the more negative voices, and it's okay. I mean, people, if you don't know him, you don't know him. If you don't ever know everything, and again, the public still doesn't have the full transcripts because I'm taking my time, putting them out there. So it's, to me, it's been, I'm grateful. I am grateful over and over and over again. And I've, you know, said to his family, and I say to people, listen, I want to honor the time and effort and interest and your prayers and your, you know, concerns for him. Because there are plenty of times I've heard stories that, like the West Memphis 3 other stories, that are really moving, they'll make you cry. But I've never taken that step to then find those people and write to those people and do, you know, like not a lot of people do that. So the fact that tens of thousands of people are doing that is incredible.
The polling that Asim did at the beginning, which showed that hardly anybody, maybe 2 or 3% of this room, thought that Adnan did it. Yeah. Did that surprise you? Is that representative of what you experienced?
You know, it didn't surprise me too much, and I kind of wonder if it's because there are a lot of South Asians in this room. I'll be honest. Number one, because and that's another thing. I've gotten maybe thousands of messages from people who are Pakistani or Indian, and we're like, oh my God, that was my life. I was totally like Adnan.
Smoking weed in the mosque.
Well, there's a lot of potheads in our community, apparently. But you know, people like it resonated with them, and they couldn't believe how that was used against him. Like they were just like shocked that could happen. I mean, like we're so used to after 9/11 these kinds of things being looked at in a terrorism context, but never in like a case like this where it's like a straight up homicide, and all of a sudden this 17-year-old. I mean, at trial, questions like, I mean, it was ridiculous. It was like, you know, just half an hour of questioning of like, how do Muslims pray? Which way do they face? Do women pray in the back? I mean, what does that have to do with like a homicide? You know, it was really odd. So that's why I wasn't too surprised, but it was, and then part of me thought, oh, maybe it's because I'm here, you don't want to make me feel bad. So everybody said that they think but I'm glad for it anyways. Thank you for whatever reason.
Was it Uric or somebody else who said, well, there couldn't have been anti-Muslim bigotry because this was prior to 9/11.
Yeah.
So that wouldn't have really applied back then.
Yeah.
Was that Uric?
That was Uric. That was
Okay.
Uric in the Intercept interview, and this is the same man who brought the issue up over and over again, from the bail hearing to the closing remarks and the trial in between. And you know, their file, this is something Sarah found. We never had this, because Sarah was able to FOIA police files this is interesting. When his lawyer FOIA the police files, he got back about 300 pages worth. Sarah got 2,000 pages worth. We don't know what is in those other 1,700 pages. We're going to try to find that out. But you know, she came to my office. She had found this memo. It was like an 8 or 10 page memo on like culture, like the Islamic culture. And this was like in the police file. This was informing, you know, how the police were conducting their investigation and how the prosecution was framing the case. And the whole thing, it was like 10 pages of not just stereotypes that actually exist, but stereotypes that are actually like made up even, you know, just completely ridiculous things about Muslims and Islam. And I thought one of the most crazy things was a whole paragraph about how if a Muslim man gives a woman a scarf as a gift, it means he now owns her. How many of Muslim men have done that? How many women do y'all own? I mean, like I was like, when I saw that, I was like, so, and the thing is, I was reading this, and I'm like literally rocking back and forth. I'm like, oh my God, this is crazy. Oh my God. And I work with police and cultural competency. So this was really, really like almost traumatic for me to read. And Sarah's like, so are you saying that's not true? I'm like, that's not true.
Okay, so that's a great, and I don't mean to cut in, but this is one of the major issues I was developing in the second half of the season is like whether she was really on top of these things and doing a good job of really inserting this issue of potential bigotry, Islamophobia, whatever.
I mean, there's a part of me that says we might never know, because I think one way that Sarah does operate is that she kind of, she might already know, like, you know, she might have a conclusion drawn in her mind, but she wants to hear, like, you know, she wants to be led there somehow, and she wants to leave room open to see what people are going to say. So even when, like, his mother said, although I will say this, and I have said this in the wake of the reports that were written about Sarah having white privilege and this and that, you know, I just think that's baloney. I think Sarah did everything she could in her power to try to figure out if that was actually the case. And I cannot expect somebody who does not live a certain reality to ever understand that reality. Forget Sarah. Adnan's current lawyer, Justin Brown, is, you know, a white man. And I have brought this issue up to him lots of times, and he's like, well, you know, it's not such a big, I'm like, it's a big deal. But he doesn't get it. You almost have to be there to get it. Like, so as a Muslim, I'm receptive to it. As a South Asian, we're like, what the hell's going on? But if you haven't lived that reality, you're thinking this, yeah, maybe, you know. So I don't blame her. I think she did her best to explore that issue.
So take yourself, you have to be there, right? So take yourself back there. You're sitting in the courtroom, you're sitting behind Adnan's family, and he's right there, and Yurik is presenting this type of line of questioning, and he's presenting it to the jury. From what you remember, do you think it had an impact on the jury?
It was like there were very few facts in the case, right? This filled up all the space. This junk filled up all the space. I mean, when I say 5 weeks, you didn't need 5 weeks to go through the facts in the case. It was a lot of this. And the real problem was that it wasn't just, Yurik would raise it, and the Gutierrez would spend hours on it. And we were like, what do you do? And none of us, so this was before 9/11, and it took 9/11 and, you know, this backlash against Muslim, for us to, as a community, kind of organize, to articulate the word Islamophobia even, to be able to recognize it and know how to handle it. But in 1999, with a community that had never seen anybody arrested before, we were just like, this is weird, but we don't know what to do. And it was deeply offensive. It was deeply offensive. But you know, one thing that I haven't talked a lot about, and I can talk about if you're interested, but is when serial, but you know, I remembered that was the lens with which people were judging Adnan and the community. And it was a concern to me as Sarah was gonna make this public that there's gonna be this 8 or 12 episodes, and now Adnan actually is a deeply devout Muslim. And I even wondered when Sarah said she was gonna go see him, I was like, I wonder how she's gonna feel, because he looks like that, you know, that archetype of the Muslim man with the skull cap and the beard and the pants rolled up. And I wondered how that would affect her reporting. I wondered how that would affect the public response for me as a Muslim woman in scarf to be blogging. Are people gonna be looking at everything that's happening, this whole case through that? But it didn't happen.
That's fascinating, actually. I mean, to think about him, because we've only seen the pictures of 17-year-old, young, smiling.
Football uniform.
Exactly. More questions?
We're going to go back to Twitter real quick, and then we're going to jump back to the audience.
So Alicia Vimawala asks, Sarah didn't let you post the initial letters between Adnan and her. Why can't you? Shouldn't all the information be transparent?
No. I mean, I respect Sarah a lot, and I put out her business once in a while when maybe she would not like me to. So I do the best I can to raise Adnan's narrative, to complete the picture, but honoring her privacy in it. That is a letter he wrote for her, and that's her property. That's how I see it.
Next.
Hi, Rabia.
Hi.
So you were just talking about the issue of Islamophobia and like the potential racism in the case. So just kind of building off of that, obviously this happened pre-9/11. Now as things can kind of potentially come back to trial, things have gotten worse. How do we potentially avoid that seeping into the case?
I mean, you know, what was, when, I actually didn't even know if, and I remember texting her lots of times, are you going to talk about the memo? Are you going to talk about the memo? I really wanted that to be, because I never knew what her episodes would be about. And when that episode finally aired and I saw the response online, it was overwhelming, like disgust and horror. People were mortified that this is like what the state was, how they had framed the case. It was such a big relief. I mean, one, if we were to get back in trial, I think we would easily handle that situation because, I mean, like if, first of all, Uric now is like, oh, it was just a run-of-the-mill domestic, you know, violence, so he's kind of backtracked on it anyways. But, you know, I think the state is very aware of the fact that they can't go there anymore and that we as a community are organized enough that we're not going to allow that to happen. Then obviously, you know, his lawyer, hopefully, if that were to happen, they were going to frame it like that, would do some kind of legal stuff, move to strike stuff, whatever, you know, like, and make sure it stays out of trial and it's never mentioned in front of a jury. One thing I just want to add to this, because this is actually something a French journalist I met with yesterday said to me, well, was asking me, why do you think like people are so fascinated with this? I'm like, I don't know, you tell me, because I know Adnan, that's why I'm like connected to it. I don't know as well. I said, why are you fascinated? Like you're all the way here from France to report on it. And he said, and I never really thought about this, he said that, because I kept thinking, wow, it's great, we haven't gotten like this negative response about him being a Muslim. He said, what's fascinating is Adnan's character, that he breaks all these stereotypes. Meaning the expectation was that as a Muslim guy, he is gonna come across in certain ways, but he totally doesn't. He's like so average Joe. He's relatable, he's funny, he's easygoing. And he's like, that's what's really amazing. And I'm like, that's really interesting. That maybe a lot of people were set up thinking that they are gonna come to a certain conclusion. They, you know, that he did not fit what they thought was gonna be this Muslim boy. So anyway, I thought I would put that out.
I mean, I thought for me, some of the favorite moments were just the regular sort of like, I mean, he's a Korean-American girl and a Pakistani-American kid, a boy, and this love affair. It's kind of like, you know, just all that kind of stuff happening. For me, it was an amazing thing when you think this is real life, and yet it is just this spectacle, this romance, of course, all the dark stuff as well. But it's amazing that sort of unknowingly, like, the country just sort of gravitates to this, like, it's this teenage story, you know, that ended obviously terribly, but this is obviously not a story that could have been told 20 or 30 years ago in terms of like the way that the demographics changing, and they're such normal kids, and I think Sarah did really do justice to that in terms of like, you know, reading through her diary and that kind of stuff, and I think that he did in that self acquit himself in terms of he had agency on the air when he did, like in terms of challenging her. It's like, wait, you really don't have an ending, right. You know, things like that, which I think were actually pretty amazing moments for him.
Yeah, I mean, I think all of us close to Adnan and Adnan himself, we wanted that ending for Sarah to just be more, you know, to be like, I believe he's innocent. Obviously, that's what we wanted, you know? And I think for Adnan, it was kind of like, what more can I give you? Like, you say I'm a nice person, I couldn't have done it, but then what? What does it mean to be a good person? Like, that has become so meaningless for him. And that's like the hard thing. It's like, so this is a guy who has no history of violence, not even in prison, right? In 16 years, he's never had a violation other than the cell phone. And I thought that was one of the best, one of the funniest moments when he talked about calling the cell phone people for his plan, and they're like, oh, just go to the, you know, local dealer. He's like, yeah, I can't do that. And I know how he got that phone, but I'm gonna keep quiet about that. But you know, yeah, so it's kind of like, you know, what would it take, you know, for him, like, how do you then even believe anybody, right? It's like, well, I've never, you know, you have Jay who's like, tells a story, it's like, oops, I lied. Tells a story, oops, I lied. I lied. And Adnan, you have yet for him to either be caught in a lie or to admit he lied, you know, to have the same consistent story ever since then, to have maintained his innocence, to have no history of violence, to have all these commendations, to have every one of his friends and, you know, kids he went to mosque with and people in high school say, not Adnan. Jay maybe, but not Adnan. Then what's left, you know? I mean, how can he, there's nothing else he can do. And that was the frustration, you know, with him saying, wow, you don't have an ending. What that means is, you still don't know how you feel about me.
Yeah. Well, Well, I do want to ask you a little more about Jay, but let's go back to the
We're going
audience.
to take one more question from Twitter, and then we'll throw it back to the audience.
Ismat Sara Mangla asks, what's going on with the Innocence Project stuff? Is what they're doing independent from current legal proceedings?
It is. So the Innocence Projects, they've been kind of retained separately, and they are kind of following, like whereas Adnan's post-conviction team is doing like kind of, they're following the legal avenues to get him a new trial. The Innocence Project is following more like investigative kind of leads, you know, like the physical evidence and other kinds of investigation. I think they're going to be interviewing people, or they have interviewed. And I don't, you know, I've been in contact with Deirdre a little bit, but not much. But we actually are slated to have a conference call or a meeting sometime in the next couple of weeks so we can coordinate, because I established, you know, have established this trust for Adnan. There's a number of volunteer attorneys on it, and we're going to be starting our investigation. So it's like we want to obviously all be on the same page. So that's going to be happening soon. They have not filed a motion yet. Part of it, I think, is because they are still undergoing, I mean, they're investigating certain leads, but also, I mean, I think it makes sense to play a card at a time. So, you know, see where the post-conviction goes, and if that fails, then you want to raise that. But I mean, but I don't have a lot of details about like exactly what they've done. But I might in a couple of weeks. But I just don't know how much I could then talk about it.
How about another question right here?
Back to the legal ramifications of if the case gets remanded back to the circuit court. One of the options being an option for an Alfred plea, but Adnan has always maintained his innocence. So do you know what his interest in something like that would be, or would he want to say, I want to clear my name at all costs?
I mean, I don't know. I know he knows that's always a possibility, and that's like a win for us, right, if that actually happens. I can tell you that for me, for his parents, for his brothers, we would put our full force behind him to take it. Being exonerated versus eating your mom's cooking one more time before you die, right? Look, if he didn't take it, decided to go back to trial and lost that trial, then he literally could actually die in prison. That for us, you know, I'm like, sign whatever document to sign it, you know, come home. That's how I feel. I think, I don't know. And sometimes some of these things are like, it's hard. Like, first of all, our conversations, I actually talked to him on the way up here, and I was like, I'm on my way to Colombia with my husband, daughter, and we're gonna be talking about your case, and he's like, you know, he was excited. But you know, we do a lot of, they're very short conversations. We're like, quickly, this is what's going on, and the legal stuff. He has trouble contacting certain people. He's like, can you pass this message? So it's rare that I can even have like these really deep conversations of, hypothetically, let's say this happens. How are you gonna, so I haven't had that conversation. And there's a part of me that doesn't want to have it. I don't know.
Well, and then you made a really important point before about hope and kind of maintaining that level. And, you know, individuals who I've worked with who are incarcerated, you know, see that it's very delicate to talk about, you know, the future options, because if it doesn't materialize, that can really be demoralizing. And it sounds like a lot of the tenor of his voice is just one of, I'm here, I'm maintaining, I'm going to take one day at a time.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. That's why. I mean, like, we don't go that far. We're doing like one proceeding at a time, you know, one petition, one motion at a time type of thing, and seeing where things go. And the thing is, you know, it's one of those things where, look at what happened in the last few months. Things can change on a dime. You have no idea what could happen. So, yeah.
How promising is the last name is Moore, the man who, the possible suspect who, is it Ronald? I can't remember his full name. The guy who basically may have, like, he was on, he'd been released, and then 10 days before the murder happened, and now they're looking into whether there may have been some sort of like act of sexual violence, that she was raped and killed by him. Yeah. It's one of the strands.
I'll be honest, I mean, in talking with the lawyers and with people who are doing some investigating, there are, I think, 2 or 3 really solid possibilities. Okay, he could be one of them. But there are even more solid possibilities than him. That's what I'll say. I think when we heard Deirdre say, big picture, Sarah, she meant, I need to get a judge to say, okay, you know, to give us the evidence to test. But I don't know. I haven't talked to Deirdre about that. Maybe she really, really believes it's a possibility. I haven't necessarily seen anything, but you know, you can't rule it out is the point, and so we shouldn't and we won't.
But apparently he, if I read correctly, he processed or is aware of this possibility that Heyman wasn't strangled, that she was actually violated in some way, and that, I mean, have you spoken to him about that this is a very traumatic on a different level, especially 15 or 16 years after the fact? Has this been part of your conversation with him at all?
No. Honestly, it's like, I'm kind of a wuss like that. I don't, like, if I don't want to cause him pain, right? Like but I do know what his reaction was when he first heard it. I know it was really hard on him. And I don't want to, people have been, you know, Sarah has been spending months, like, you know, picking the scabs. I don't want to pick the scabs. I want to leave it. And so I haven't talked to him about it. And I think if something actually materializes, then we will, right? But right now, it's a theory.
One of the think pieces that kind of came out of this included a New York Times op-ed by a law professor about the plea bargaining system. And I'm wondering, from the perspective of both visibility and more transparency around that, what you think. And do you think that Adnan should have maybe pled out if could he have taken a plea if his lawyer had let him know?
I mean, obviously, in a hindsight 2020, yeah, if he had been able to get a plea at the time, he should have taken the plea. And what had happened, and just to make clear how that even came about with him approaching Gutierrez for the plea, when he was arrested, immediately he got letters from Agent McCain. Literally, like in the same couple of days after, like within the week, he got 2 letters from her. And he passed those on. Now, he wasn't aware. The state did not tell Gutierrez what their, what their timeline of the crime was. They weren't sure when in that day he was supposed to like kind of account for his time. They had never, they hadn't turned over Jay's statements until right like either the day of or the day before the first trial. So in a way, Christina was kind of flying blind, and Adnan was doing his best just to account for as much as he could, because he didn't know what time in the day they were going to say. He didn't know what the witness had said. The state wouldn't even tell them who the witness was. He knew it because the police had mentioned Jay to him, so he's like, that's got to be it. But the state never, like the DA's office never told them. So when I think after being incarcerated, I mean, he was being held in just the city detention center, with a bunch of other inmates. And after 5 or 6 months, he's like, his lawyer has said, well, Asia didn't check out. And he's like, well, do you have other people lined up who can account for my day? And it doesn't seem like she really did. And she didn't. She did not pursue any witnesses at all. She presented nobody at all who could say, I remember him on that day, and at all. At that point, he was feeling very, very demoralized. And now he's surrounded by inmates. This is the environment where they're like, you are screwed. They're gonna, because it wasn't just a charge of murder. It was murder, kidnapping, false imprisonment. He was getting the book thrown at him, So administrator, listen, if you have no idea what happened that day, all you're relying on is the fact that the state's case maybe is not that strong, but you don't know how strong it is. So maybe you want to ask if the state's offering a plea. So that's when he contacted Gutierrez and said, when he realized that I have nobody who can say where I was that day, and then I got horribly high that night and I blanked out. Other than definitely he had to go to school that day, definitely he was at track, but it wasn't like specific witnesses, right, that were coming forward. So he asked her, and she said to him that no, they're not offering a plea. The first trial happened 3 days. After 3 days, it was a mistrial. Then he asked her again, and she said no, and that was the end of that. So, but she had never asked them actually.
Is it true? Was there no plea on the table?
Well, yeah, the state says she never approached us for it. And the state's like, well, we wouldn't have offered one. But the point is, that's not the point. The point is that he asked her to go talk to them about it, and she didn't do it, and then she lied to him. So the state admits that she never came to us to talk to us about this question,
Before I jump to the next question, hashtag SAJA serial right now is trending nationally.
Oh my God.
So whatever you're
So don't
doing, keep
cuss.
taking photos, keep tweeting, keep Instagramming, Facebook, whatever, hashtag SAJA serial.
Job all
Just
right.
keep it up, whatever you're doing.
Time.
That's great. All right, so questions?
Radio voice.
Right over here.
That was great.
So you've been dealing with the state long before Serial aired. Have you noticed any change in your interactions or a change in the pace with which they're reviewing the things that you're bringing forward?
You're talking about the state, the DA's office? I have no interactions with them at all.
Oh.
No, I mean, that's been the purview of his lawyers. Yeah, I mean, so I've never represented Adnan, and that's one thing, I want to make clear that people say, well, you're a lawyer, so what about your ethic, this and that, and how do you feel? I'm like, this is my little brother. I don't approach this like I'm a lawyer. I was never represented, and I never would, because I think I would end up like fighting somebody in the courtroom, like wrestling them to the ground or something. But yeah, it's very emotional. So I don't know, but I do know, and I've been told, and the Baltimore legal communities, like a lot of communities, are very tight. They know what's going on. They're talking about stuff. They're like, oh my God. So I have heard that they're paying very, very close attention to what's happening in the public's response, and what witnesses are saying, and they've listened to the show. So they're paying attention. And that's part of the reason, like, we have the petition not that the petition is going to move the court, maybe anyway, but it might move the DA's office to consider how they're going to proceed. But generally speaking, so far, all we've seen is, what you expect, which is resistance. We oppose the petition. We move to strike them, but whatever. So, they're going to keep opposing. But I will say, though, I was a little bit surprised at the weakness of this last filing. It was a pretty weak response, which I'm like, maybe that means they're like, we just had to do it, and let's give this, kid another shot at appeal. I don't know.
All right, there's a question over on this side that here we go.
Hi, can you talk a little bit more about Adnan's feelings or reaction towards Jay and his impact on this entire situation?
Are you talking about now, or are you talking about like 15 years ago? Okay, so when the Jay interview came out, okay, in The Intercept, it was one of those weeks, and literally this happened in the last few days, where I missed like 5 of his calls in a row. It was just one of those, like I had a couple of weeks where I just couldn't connect with him, and I can't call him, he has to call me. So a couple of weeks had gone by before I actually talked to him, and I was like, but I knew he had talked about it with his brother, and people across the country are like, immediately send him everything. So he got like 6 copies of that interview in the mail. So when I talked to him, and then the Uric interview, same thing, he was pretty astonished. But he laughed, he was laughing. Because he's like, what's hilarious is, first of all, if I was Jay's lawyer, I would be like, shut up, you're not talking to anybody. He has no need to, right? Should he be talking to me? So I've always actually wondered about what is the why, like why? Why is he talking? Why is Uric talking? What are they planning? Something's going up, and I think it's coordinated.
Well, he said he wants to set the record straight. His wife is being, various people in his family are being hassled. It's not a good look, and he thinks he can improve it. I mean, when I read The Intercept, people, I was like, oh, he seems like a decent guy, and then. But please respond.
I mean, if you want friends like that, cool, that's fine. But no, so that's true, but it's not lost on me that the same person, look, his lawyer found the reporter to do the report, and that same reporter then interviewed Uric when he wouldn't be interviewed by anybody else. So I certainly believe that they had this coordinated, and I don't think Jay said anything that he hadn't already gotten okayed by, you know what I mean? I mean, I can't imagine him going on in that interview and completely changing the timeline of the case, and nobody knew he was going to do that. Uric didn't know, and this lawyer didn't know. So I don't know, like, why that happened. That's what I think.
But you think that the article has greatly helped your case, correct? Adnan's case,
yeah,
rather.
I do
and
think
how?
so.
What is it about? What did he say or do that has done that?
Well, he is saying that I lied on the stand. He's saying the story I told on the stand was I lied in many different ways. He's saying that, number one, I never saw her buried. I was never there, right? Like, I have no idea he did it by himself. Whereas in all his police statements and his testimony, he's very detailed about seeing the burial, about the way she's positioned, about where her hands are in the grave, about which way her face is facing. He talks about what she looks like, what parts of her body are blue. I mean, he's very, very detailed, and all of a sudden he's saying, I never saw it. Next, obviously, is the infamous trunk pop, right? Like, where was that trunk pop? It was popped all over Baltimore. But now it's been popped in front of grandma's house, right? So we have yet another location, and then we have a burial at midnight. Now, the state, what really, really damned Adnan in the trial was that they alleged that there are 2 cell phone calls made from the Lincoln Tower cell site at 7 o'clock, and Jay said that's when we buried her. Now Jay is saying we buried her like close to midnight. So, you know, I mean, so, but he's also saying I lied. He's like, I lied to protect my grandma, I lied to protect this. So he's saying I committed perjury. That helps us. This means if they were gonna go back to trial, I don't know which version they would use. What was interesting was when Yurik spoke, Yurik still stuck to the, yeah, she was killed by 236. I'm like, did you not read Jay's interview? Like, what are you doing? It was weird. But so Adnan laughed. Adnan said, and the thing is, because Adnan is a deeply faithful person, he's like, they didn't have to say some of the things they said. And Yurik also, and I knew it was coming, and I was crossing my fingers. I'm like, Yurik, please repeat the fact that, you know, Asia said that she was pressured to write those documents. I'm like, please repeat it, because I knew her affidavit was coming. We've known about Asia being back in the game for at least 2 months now. We were just waiting. But we were waiting because obviously she actually had to be at a point where she was gonna actually write the affidavit and go through all of it. But she had started communicating, at least, you know, with Sarah, and saying, I want my voice to be present in this because I think it was a miscarriage of justice. So when Yurik did say that, oh, you know, she was pressured to write, I'm like, yes, you know, keep burying yourself deeper. That's cool. So yeah, for Adnan, he's like, it's, you know, this is justice, that they are saying things that are gonna really harm them in the future. And, you know, I don't know. I was happy to read the interviews, though. I hope they keep giving interviews. That's fine
But
with me.
it comes back to that point about Adnan's style. You said he laughed as opposed to him getting angry.
Yeah, he might have gotten angry when he first heard it, but I doubt it. I mean, I didn't even get angry. I was just like amazed. I was like,
You were happy.
I was happy. If you look at my tweets from that day, I think BuzzFeed actually turned my tweets into a story. Like, that's how excited I was that day. I was extremely happy. I'm like, this is great. Why would we be angry? We're like, yeah, totally, you know, admit to perjury and totally change the timeline so the cell phone records are meaningless. And great, now let's go back to trial.
Question?
Another question?
Listening to it, I was always curious as to at what point Adnan realized that this story had become such a widely listened to thing, that there were people all across the country that knew his story. And I'm wondering, even now, you said they get the print papers, but does he even now realize just how big Serial had become?
I think look, I mean, he's been getting consistently for the last 3-4 months 4 or 5 letters a day, which is a lot of mail. And he's seen a lot of the articles, but he is not exposed to social, he can't be on Twitter, right? He doesn't know what's happening on Reddit. He knows Reddit exists and the subreddit exists, and I've printed out some of the threads for him. But so he can't see the full impact of it, but he does know that it is a wildly popular. He knows that Saturday Night Live did a bit on it, which was crazy. He knows that Sarah was on Colbert, which is crazy. Like it was like, I texted Sarah, I'm like, oh my God, Sarah, it's like you and Barack Obama. I mean, like, you're like the final guest on Colbert. So he, you know, so he understands like that, but at the same time, he can't witness what I witness. Is like every morning I wake up with my eyes barely open. I'm like, what's going on Reddit, right? Like, he doesn't see that there's this constant, intense, like, you know, people are just so still deep into it. And I get so many, I mean, I've printed some messages, but I get so many messages every single day, whether it's Facebook messages, on Twitter, or in my email, and you know, every single day I get messages where people are just either want to say, we just support you, we're praying for you, we're donating, what can we do? Or they have like these really crazy long theories. So.
What's the craziest theory?
I don't think I can say it. I don't think I can say it because it implicates somebody that we've all heard about in the podcast, and I don't want to say who it is. Don't
Stay
go
tuned.
there. Don't
I mean,
go there.
Reddit, it's like a fan fiction
It
genre
is.
practically, like, And it's just like people just tossing off whatever ideas. And then Jay did this. And then
Yeah.
she did that, Kathy or whoever.
And there's like a number of subreddits now. It's
Right.
not just the serial it's like the other ones have like developed, and so people are going because people don't want to be moderated. There's all kinds of drama on Reddit. It's really interesting, but the theories have been, oh my gosh, they've just been crazy. I mean, they're okay. Maybe the craziest one, and this one I will talk about, is that Adnan's mother did it. Yep, that was a theory. That Adnan's mother was like, you're dating my son. Because, Adnan had said that my mom was taking mileage on my car. And somebody actually sent me a message saying, Adnan's family has a garage. So maybe his mother did it, then drove Hayes' car into her garage with the body. And I mean, it was this really lengthy, and I'm like, okay. I mean, what am I supposed to do? That was one of the craziest.
But we know Sarah didn't have anything to do with it. And she
Sarah
didn't
Koenig?
concoct this as a way to get ratings or anything like that. That didn't happen, right, for sure.
You never know, but I doubt it.
I think we have a questioner apparently
Yes.
over here who's been waiting for a
A
long
long time, yeah.
One group of people we've not heard from is Hayes' family. I would love to get your take on their decision to remain quiet throughout this entire process, and also whether, as an active member of the community in Baltimore, whether you have heard anything either directly from them or indirectly.
So they moved out of the community a long time ago. And when you say community, like Adnan was, I mean, his peer group was connected to them because of high school, right? Because of school, they went to school together. So when I say our community, like the mosque, like we weren't connected to that community necessarily. They moved out of the area a long time ago. I know that Sarah had tried to contact them. I was never clear on whether she was able to get through until the podcast started. And to me, the fact, and it seemed, I mean, apparently her brother is listening to it because somebody posted on Reddit, and it was apparently verified that I am Hayes' brother and this is what's happening. The fact that they haven't said anything, to me, indicates that they want to know also the truth. That maybe, because they're letting it play out, right? They could easily come forward and say, this is really painful, and the person who killed our daughter is in jail and we want him to rot there. I'm like, why not, right? But the fact that they're quiet, and I think part of it might be not only the fact that a lot of people are hearing about all these weird things that happen in the case and the investigation now, but also that Adnan was friendly, like they knew Adnan. Her brother knew him and was friendly with him, and maybe somewhere in his mind he now is thinking that this maybe was the wrong person. But that's how I'm interpreting their silence. I don't even know if her mother's listening, but apparently the brother is. And I think, justice for Hay means, the right person being in prison. And if I was in their position and the idea that the person who killed my daughter has been living their life for the last 16 years would be really painful.
We have a question in the back.
Hi, good night. I was just wondering if you folks have found any similar cases, and if so, have they been helpful? How did they play out? Was the defense, for instance, as egregious?
Are you talking about like in Baltimore? Or what do you mean?
Specifically in reference to his case when it first came up. Did they research and find any cases that were similar that they can reference in any way, shape, or form?
I mean, similar to the extent that there are a lot of cases that Gutierrez was tied to. About 28 or 29 different clients of hers raised similar grievances against her. She broke the record in Maryland for attorney grievances. And so the fact that there was a pattern there of so many clients who were saying she did essentially the same thing, which was take money and then not do the work, or not be even responsive, or not be available, not talk. I mean, look, when Adnan was convicted, the day he was convicted, the next 2 weeks, she wouldn't respond to him or us or the family. Like, over and over, like we're reaching out, he's like, and she wouldn't respond. And so that is a similarity, definitely. Now, there's also questions of like police, I don't want to say misconduct, but certain patterns of like investigation and things, how the Baltimore PD was operating at the time that have been raised recently, and I think that requires like deeper examination. And I wished Sarah actually had done that. I didn't think Sarah really dug deep into how the police department was operating at the time, how that impacted other cases, and the detectives, I thought she was really easy on because some of the detectives have been implicated in some shady stuff, but she did not touch it.
So, on Cristina Gutierrez, there a lot came out in writings in your own blog. We heard it in the podcast about the quality of her work, about the attitude that she had, maybe not being responsive to Adnan or to the families. And right now, on this appeal, on this collateral review, there's the legal argument that Adnan should get a new trial because there was ineffective assistance of counsel, so his right to counsel effectively wasn't there. It's an extremely high bar. Courts have found that you could have your lawyer literally asleep at the table during trial, and that is not enough to say that your lawyer was ineffective. Like, just having a bad lawyer or a nasty lawyer or a mean lawyer doesn't get you over this ineffective assistance of counsel claim. So, look, what is the best argument for why Gutierrez was truly ineffective as a lawyer as opposed to just being, a bad lawyer or a lawyer who didn't have the best strategy or a lawyer who you just didn't agree with?
Right. I mean, I think two things I want to say about that. Number one, I think there is, even though you're right, lawyers can do horrible, horrible things to their clients and still not be found ineffective. Failure to contact or reach out an alibi witness has been found to meet the bar of ineffective assistance. Okay, so that's established. So now what happened in the post-conviction was that, number one, we had Uric say that, well, she wasn't a real alibi because she was forced to make the documents. And number two, Adnan, well, it was really odd. The judge in his order, in his ruling, said that the reason she says she saw him at the library, but Adnan says he was still at school till track practice. Now, the strange thing is, first of all, Adnan never testified to that. That was like in some opening statement or something. But also the judge was failing to realize that these things are almost like they're on the same campus, essentially. The school and the library are on the same campus. So when Adnan says, I was like at school, pretty much that means I was still on the campus. So the judge did not consider her an alibi, but now we're hoping that this new court will. The second thing I want to say, and I was speaking to a group of law students yesterday, and I said to them, one thing we have to, when people are kind of trying to examine if what the prosecutor did was okay, if what Gutierrez did was okay, I'm like, there's only two possible conclusions. Number one is that they failed miserably, they were terrible, right? They broke their ethical duties or whatever. And in that case, obviously, we need remedy. But the other possibility is actually even more, maybe, I think, troubling. And that is that they actually were well within, what is okay for a lawyer and a prosecutor and police to get away with. And that then means that the reason systems keep failing and innocent people end up in jails because we have way too much leeway with what we allow like lawyers to get away with and prosecutors to get away with. And just getting by shouldn't be enough. I mean, when you have somebody's life in your hand, it's defense counsel. The reason I specifically said that, because these are law students who are going to be, defense attorneys and prosecutors and judges one day, is that you have somebody's life and then the lives of all the people they love in your hands. You have to perform optimally, not just what can I get away with. So I think it is a much worse case scenario to think that it's okay. I mean, that was a fair trial. That bothers me more.
All right, we have 10 minutes left. Let's try and get as many questions as we can get in. Anyone on this row? I have not seen any hands on this row. Nothing? All right. Here we go.
Sheriff, if you want, maybe take two questions back to back, and then Rabia can navigate.
So I've gotten a sense through this of Adnan's voice as mediated and as edited, first through the podcast and then also through you. And you mentioned that he doesn't have access to the internet. What are the restrictions on what media he can see and what media outlets he can communicate with?
So
Let's take another question. And then.
Second, here we go.
Has Adnan told you what he would do if he got freed?
Okay, so in terms of media outlets, he is, what's interesting is that I think when Adnan calls a person, there's a little recording beforehand, and we've heard this in the podcast. I've never in all these years paid attention. I just wait for it to be over so I can just press 0 and talk to him. But that recording actually says you are not allowed to record conversations. And Sarah had been recording all these conversations. And when the state, I guess, was listening, and it was literally like in week 10. At week 10, they called the facility and they're like, this guy's been talking to a reporter, she's been recording conversations. You gotta like take away his phone privileges. So the guy who runs that system really likes Adnan. So he kind of was like, whatever. But, you know, so that even there's that restriction, right? And it's really hard for him to meet people. You have to be on a list to be able to meet him. He's in a maximum security facility. This is a facility that has had documentaries made about it as one of the supermaxes in the country. It's that that much lockdown there. So if for Sarah to even get on the list, he can only make changes to that list like once a year. It's a ridiculous restriction. And people have said to me, can I go see Adnan? Can he call me? No, I'm sorry. But also he has a phone list. So he's very, very restricted in that sense. And then what he can consume, I think the way it works is, and I'm not completely clear on it because it's changed every time they've moved him. And sometimes it can change depending on what's just happening in the prison, like they'll go on lockdown, something will happen. Is that they have small televisions in each room. And they have like an internal cable system that gives them access to 2 or 3 channels. And then that's it. But then he can have an Xbox, and I think he can play CDs in it, but not DVD. Like they're not allowed to have DVDs, I believe. So it's pretty. But then they do get print publications. You know, he does have the freedom to write, though. He can write to people. He's been writing to. If journalists contacted him through letters, it would take time, but that he would respond to. The second question was what Adnan would do if he was out. I haven't talked to him, but I can't imagine he would do anything other than just spend time with his family. I mean, his father's elderly, he's in his 80s, and I'm sure Adnan would not want to miss like a moment with his parents.
Let's get 2 more questions.
Hi, Rabia. I have a question about the investigation. I remember in one of the episodes initially when they'd mentioned someone had called the police, an anonymous caller saying, look to the boyfriend, or look to the ex-boyfriend. Did that ever come up in the stuff that you were looking through, that Sarah was digging through, and are there any legal sort of implications or consequences of that?
I mean, the legal implications were that Adnan was convicted, he was arrested. I mean, really that is what triggered, apparently, I mean, on the surface, from what we understand, that is what triggered the police to suddenly forget the current boyfriend and look at the, I'm sorry, you have a fault, like, just to clarify your question?
I mean, who was that caller?
Who was that
Because that person clearly has a motive to say, look at Adnan, and I feel like the police never really followed up on it, and I was wondering if you guys did, or if that's,
I mean,
if that even means anything.
I'm reasonably confident, and I actually blogged about this, but I know who the caller is, and the reason I am pretty sure I know who it is because his cousin told me it was him. And this happened just a couple months ago at a restaurant, a Pakistani restaurant where we happened to run into each other. And the thing is, what's interesting is that the caller had, in the police report it said Asian male, and it's like the only way you would know is because or there's an accent, right? And in Adnan's peer group, there are only like 2 people who had accents, right? This was also somebody who knew Adnan and knew about the Hay, and so I was like, okay, that really narrows down the world. And then it was like, why? And so the particular person who I'm pretty sure I would like bet on it, has also run into, you know how communities are, right? Grapevines. He's run into other people and he's had some really odd interactions when they talk about this. He gets very defensive. So once his cousin said, I was like, this is what I think, and he's like, yeah, I think you're right. We know who it is. And what his cousin said to me was that, listen, this kid, number one, he's one of those people who, like Adnan was very popular and he was athletic and he was nice and he was just all around, people just liked him for a lot of different reasons. And this guy's cousin said that, listen, this kid, like he had a lot of issues at that age and he had jealousy issues, he probably, and it sounds so weird that somebody would do that, but the bigger reason I think is that, and again, this was confirmed by a few people, is that he was also friends with Jay. And he would smoke pot with Jay, so they used to kick it together. And my theory is, now that we've heard in the podcast that Jay told like 10 different people that Adnan did, like he was talking to all kinds of people, is that maybe Jay told him that Adnan did it and I saw it. And this guy, believing that that's true, made the phone call.
But Rabia, do you think it
made a difference? Like, if that phone call hadn't been made to the cops, wouldn't they have gone to Adnan anyway because he's the ex-boyfriend?
I mean, I don't know. Maybe I assume they would, but I think they would have done it after a more thorough investigation of the current boyfriend. I mean, because the current boyfriend's alibi was his mother, okay? In terms of his employment records, there's some, I mean, because, you know, here's the interesting thing. So when they got to trial, Gutierrez had to subpoena the records of the boyfriend, Don. The police didn't have the records. They had no proof that he was actually working that day. It took some time to get that from so they didn't have it readily available. So it's almost like the police talked to the manager, his mother. She told them this, and then they backed. And so we don't know. The first record we have of those employment records appearing anywhere was actually after Gutierrez over and over and over again requested them. And then the records look a little bit wonky, like something is a little bit off about them. But they didn't they tested the blood that they found and hairs against Adnan, but they didn't test it against Don. So they didn't conduct a thorough investigation before moving on to Adnan.
And were you surprised that Don was not more of a player in Serial?
You mean that Sarah didn't explore him more?
Right.
I think Sarah, I think Sarah has to be very careful, legally where she goes with this stuff. But also I'm saying that, assuming that maybe she has the same kind of suspicions I might have. Maybe Sarah really believes he's fine. I don't know. I thought his interview, eventually when he did it, was odd. I also thought the fact that Hay had written a note for him that day meant that she was either going to see him, or she was going to go somewhere where he was going to be. She was going to drop that note either at his house or his place of work or on his car. She wrote that note for him for that day, and it said, "I'm sorry, I can't stay," or "I couldn't stay," or something. So what was that?
What did you mean legally Sarah has to be careful?
I don't think Sarah can run around speculating, did Don kill her, did Jay kill her, the whole internet can do it. But I think Sarah has to be very careful about stuff. And also, I mean, honestly, I don't know. I have always felt like Sarah didn't, Sarah could have been a little more critical of Gutierrez, of the detectives, of the prosecutor, of a lot of people, and she kind of was very measured in that. She was kind of like that with everybody in the whole story, I think.
We're gonna do 2 more questions and that's it. We got one over here.
Hi, Rabia Chaudry.
Hi. Wait a minute, are you Rabia Chaudry
I am
too? You are. Hi, Rabia Chaudry.
Wait, who's the real Rabia Chaudry?
I think
What's
she's
the
the real.
deal with Rabia Chaudry?
Definitely real.
Next.
Oh no, the coincidences go further than that. But anyway, we'll talk about that
We
later.
have the same middle name, actually.
We have the same middle name. We're both Rabia Anwar
Rabia
Chaudry.
Chaudry, yeah. Is it true that Adnan got married in jail?
It is true. It is true.
This is really?
Yeah.
This is interesting.
Yeah.
Did Reddit hear this?
Reddit, he heard it, and it was like a blip, and it went away because nobody. And I'm surprised that Sarah didn't talk about it. So Adnan Sarah talked to her, to his ex-wife. He did. He met somebody, and what happens in visitation sometimes, you'll be in a room with a bunch, and in different facilities it's different, but a lot of times you're in the same space. So there'll be a bunch of inmates in the middle, and there's a barrier around and family members. So he, I don't know, kind of met this girl while she was visiting somebody else, and talked to the inmate and was like, "So who is that?" I don't know the whole. I haven't gotten into it because he's like my little brother. I don't want to know too many details. I want to know just okay. But I remember he told me when it happened. He told me that he had met somebody and he wanted to get married and she wanted to marry him, and he was very happy and she seemed very lovely. And I think. At the time, he was still pursuing direct appeal, so maybe there was some hope that he would be home soon. He told his parents, Auntie Shamim did not take that well. So she's like, what? Even in prison, she's like, no, you can't get married without my approval. So she's a typical Pakistani mom.
Prison.
Prison, yeah, in prison. So I had to talk to her. I'm like, listen, let him be happy,
She's
So-
all these plans for the wedding and what she's gonna wear and what he's gonna wear.
I know. No, but it was a time of a lot of happiness for him, and she seemed like a wonderful person. But I think eventually they both had to come to the decision that it didn't seem like he was going to be going anywhere for a long time. And but they're still in touch, and you know, she cares very much about him, and she has only good things. And so he put her in touch with Sarah. But I don't know why Sarah didn't talk. I thought that was kind of odd. I thought that would be a really interesting piece of the story.
And one last question.
Thanks for everything. Yep. But so traditionally, the journalistic profession has had to have the responsibility of serving as a check against corruption of all kinds. Corruption of this kind, you know, being an example. Do you feel like we, you know, us and the public, in our desire for content, and the media in its sort of desire to put out content, have crossed the line now into really creating courts of public opinion that are resulting in sort of a trial outside of the legal system or the establishment that's actually the processes and the procedures that are there to actually try these cases? And, you know, particularly not just this case, but in sort of the more social justice sort of examples of Trayvon Martin and George Zimmerman, you know, what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, the short answer is yes, absolutely. I mean, everybody is now a judge, a juror, a prosecutor, a defense counsel. And I think that's actually a good thing. I think that's what we need media for. We want media to shine lights on things that we abhor, things that we need to fix, things that are deeply, deeply wrong. And you know, Sarah was not just an investigator here, she's a storyteller. So I think she had certain lines where she had to stay within, but definitely there's a lot more that can be investigated in this case, just about the system itself, about how the prosecutor operated and how the Baltimore police was operating. But it is, and I think, I personally think it's a good thing. I mean, I know that it can get ugly sometimes. I know, like, for example, in the aftermath of the Boston bombings, a Reddit community, in fact, like wrongly identified from the fuzzy whatever tapes, identify the wrong people, and that really hurt somebody. So there are lines like, you know, doxing, like, so there are those kind of limits that can really hurt people in terms of, you know, but certain online forums having added measures of, like, you know, we're not going to tolerate, like, you know, people divulging private information, locations of people, this and that, that helps mitigate it. But look, if I was Jay, or if I was his wife, or if I was somebody who was part of his family, this would be a nightmare. This would be a nightmare, because just because Sarah didn't talk about it, and just because you can't find it easily, doesn't mean you can't find all kinds of information about him, and all kinds of information about all kinds. I had a call the other day. This guy called me and said, I know Stephanie's parents' names. I know what businesses they run. I mean, like, this is information in 15, 16 years I've never even tried to pursue. I don't want to go there. So that can be, that can really be the danger of it. You know?
On that note,
ladies and gentlemen, a big round of applause for Rabia Chaudry, Yasin Rahman, and Arun.
Thank you.
And they will be mingling about, so feel free to come up, and thank you for coming. And please support SAJA, and we have 2 board members back there. Please raise your hands. They did a great job. I want to thank Columbia Journalism School.
Thanks, SAJA.
For
Thanks,
hosting
SAJA.
this. Thank you very much. Have a good night.